Hello, everyone. This is Aran. I'm an educator of philosophy based in Austin. Today, we continue our discussion on Hegel's Science of Logic with my great friend Tren. Tren?
Hi everyone. This is Sean, your great friend. Early, his culture has started in early medieval Europe and the late medieval China. Great to be with you today, Aaron, and to comb through Hegel's Science of Logic.
Yes. So let me start with an introduction that kind of covers a lot of, we have talked about a lot of stuff from the beginning of this section of the Versucha podcast and on Hegel's Science of Logic. So to kind of put things together and putting them into a context, we need to understand what Hegel is doing, why Hegel is doing it, and then we can emphasize on the specific points that is made in this book. So what Hegel is doing in some ways is very much parallel to a post-Enlightenment demand of absolute self-criticism and not taking for granted anything like basic about the world. And this is also paralleled, interestingly enough, with another tradition in ancient Greece, which ended up, being Pharaonian skepticism and the ancient skepticism of the Greek city-states. And in some ways, this is a side note, but Hegel had a lot more appreciation for the ancient version of skepticism than the modern version of skepticism. But something that is more familiar to us is someone like Descartes, right? What is Descartes doing? Descartes is kind of positioning himself against something like medieval philosophy, scholasticism, and even like all the points about using the Aristotelian presuppositions for all sorts of lines of inquiry. He wants to say that, okay, we need to be able to suspend all of that, revisit the basic points, and start from somewhere that is not just contingent upon uncritical approval of a tradition of thinking, right? His version of this story is the version of emphasizing on a secure ground. His image is to start from somewhere that is absolutely certain, and from that absolute certainty, we can establish a system. Someone like Kant is doing something similar in a very different way, that he is in some ways in epistemology first type of a person. He wants to know what we can know and what is the limits of our knowledge and what we can actually make sense of. And to do so, he emphasizes on a very basic conditions of the possibility of our experience of the world and our relationship with the world, and on the relationship between concepts and being. That's what Kant does. The relationship between the concepts and being has become something central for him, and he is doing an investigation that is a priori in the sense that is not about this or that experience, but is about the conditions of the possibility of experience. Okay, now Hegel is interested in both of these things, starting from somewhere that does not have random presuppositions as its foundation, and he's interested in the relationship between thinking and being as a very basic relationship. That's just maybe the most possible basic relationship available to us. He is very different from Descartes and Kant in many different ways. But what we need to kind of remember here is that what he wants to do, the beginning for him. So for Kant, he thinks that he just begins with assumptions. And he thinks the same about Descartes. And he thinks that they are able to suspend certain presuppositions, but they are not going all the way through. And the suspension of presuppositions at the beginning does not need to, in Descartes' way, to arrive us as a foundation, but it should arrive us as a place of absence of presuppositions. It's a very different place. Starting from a position that doesn't have any presuppositions doesn't mean that position is right as a foundation. It just means it doesn't have presuppositions. What it is further needs to be determined as we look at it, but we don't know it. Hence, anti-Cartesian element of Hegel's philosophy. Also, any question about the relationship between us and the world, the relationship between our conceptual apparatus and the world in itself is contingent upon making all sorts of distinctions, all distinctions that are actually presupposed between subject and object and so on and so forth. Being and thought in Kant's system as well. So Hegel's beginning is just embodying this need for presuppositionlessness. And this presuppositionlessness is not a presuppositionlessness in a comprehensive way, which makes everything impossible, because we're talking and like having conversation itself has millions of presuppositions about it. It's about lacking of presuppositions insofar as the relation between being and thought goes. Hence the problem with Descartes and Kant. What is suspended in Hegel is any sort of founding presupposition about being and thought, which means being and thought are merged. Being and thought are not thought to be different from one another, but they are immediately the same. And that is not a foundation in a Cartesian way, but that's the best place to begin an inquiry that actually wants to derive distinctions instead of presupposing distinctions. Hegel gives the image or the idea of this presuppositionlessness as understood as the absence of distinction between being and thought as pure immediacy. When we think about pure immediacy is, if the truth is pure immediacy, any sort of distinction, conceptual distinction, that we make between things ends up being artificial and unnecessary. The truth is pure immediacy, and there is in that pure immediacy a lack of differentiation. It just is. It's there immediately without any sort of mediation involved. Hegel calls the idea of pure immediacy being. Remember to not conflate being with any sort of conception of being that you might have as like the common denominator of things or anything like that. Being in Hegel's science of logic, pure immediacy. We can even disregard the name being, called A. The beginning point A is pure immediacy. And what happens is that Hegel wants to say that, okay, if we have pure immediacy is a claim of completeness, of having everything in it. Now, if our engagement with pure immediacy shouldn't be that, but pure immediacy is whatever, I don't like it, or it just is wrong, and this because they are objects in the world, or something that doesn't take pure immediacy seriously. We need to engage with pure immediacy and take it seriously. And if we do that, and some sort of an internal flaw pops up, that means pure immediacy is not working in a satisfactory way. That means that pure immediacy ends up being something else. Or pure immediacy, when you look at it, ends up being not just pure immediacy, but also something else. We're going to talk about that transition shortly. But that's the idea of immanence. The first part of Hegel's science of logic begins with this insanely short description of the first transition in the book, from being to nothing, from pure immediacy to absolute indeterminacy and undifferentiatedness. What we want to uncover is that this move from pure immediacy to indeterminacy, and from indeterminacy back to pure immediacy, which are the transitions of the beginning of science of logic, discussed in a very cryptic way. What do they mean? What does that mean? What is moving? Why is it moving imminently? What is the difference between moving imminently and not moving imminently? How is this different from any sort of external criticism of a concept? Is Hegel successful in actually not presupposing anything in this transition? How could we show if he's successful and how he's not? And these are just a couple of questions that we're gonna discuss here in this episode. So before we begin, Trent, do you have anything to add to this rather long summary?
No, it sounds really, really helpful, and I hope that provides a context or background for listeners who are not very familiar with our previous engagement with Hegel's introduction to this project, and we do want to emphasize his introduction, and those episodes are, in our eyes, very helpful for contextualizing Hegel's project and highlight certain really unique features about his project. So his brevity, his dealing with one movement within a sentence, that sort of move can only make sense once we understand what he's after and why such a thing as, say, the collapse from being into nothing is so trivially true in his eyes. If it only holds if we, as you said, understand being as a certain thing, not identical to commonsensical definition of it, and nothing likewise. Yes. Shall we proceed?
Yes. So let's talk about the main issue that we introduced at the end of the last episode, and it is the whole idea of collapsing imminently. And here, let me thank my dear friend Cecilia, who also brought this to my view, that it is rather odd to think about any sort of absolute immanence, right? That a concept could fall short on its own terms. What does that even mean? Like, how could we not introduce other concepts in like criticizing the insufficiencies of immediacy? Insufficiencies of, sorry, like not just immediacy, but any sort of concept. Then just how could we only emphasize on the concept itself, and just as if we just look at it and in front of our eyes it just collapses. So before getting into this whole thing about pure immediacy, the immanent collapse of pure immediacy, I just want to give a little bit more concrete image of what this immanence, as opposed to external criticism, means. And in the context of the example that I'm gonna give, I think it's gonna be clear what this means, but it gets more sophisticated, of course, when we get back to pure immediacy. Now, think about a hedonist, okay? Someone who thinks that, whatever, maximizing pleasure at every given moment of life should be the goal. That type of hedonism. Like, there are all sorts of hedonists, right? So any sort of decision-making at any point should be about maximizing pleasure in that episode, okay? Now, let's just add an important detail, that this hedonist wants to do this because it wants to maximize pleasure at the end, right? So it's thinking that through time, I want to have the maximum pleasure that I can get. And that means, here's the reasoning, I need to maximize pleasure at every episode, right? So it's a very sum total kind of a view of pleasure. I maximize pleasure at every episode. That means I have the most pleasure at the end, whatever that end means. That doesn't matter. Like in a year or in my lifetime, it doesn't matter. Now, if this is a position, like think about this as a position. Now, if someone shows up and says to the hedonist that you're wrong, hedonist, this is not good. And if the hedonist asks why, and the other person says because, Jesus says so, right? That's not an external criticism. Because if the hedonist does not recognize the authority of, Jesus's teaching, then that has no effect on, nothing collapses. This is an external criticism. Now, if the hedonist, finds Jesus, then yes, that will become something that just becomes a discrepancy. But it is not even the discrepancy that is within hedonism in this way that I described. It's just about incoherence of a couple of different perspectives, right? Our hedonist just realizes that he cannot have both of these, right? But when we say that he cannot have both of these, we're talking about lack of coherence of different perspectives. You want to be both a true Christian and be an absolute hedonist, and these two may not go together. But none of this is immanence. Even if the hedonist accepts the teachings of Jesus, it is something external that is disrupting his variant of hedonism. But if I show up and tell the hedonist that, okay, you are doing this because you want to maximize pleasure at the end. But let me show you that if you maximize pleasure at every episode, you actually cannot maximize pleasure at the end. You actually end up lowering your chances of maximizing pleasure at the end. That's something immanent. Why? Because I have shown that based on the premises and the goals of the hedonist of our story, there is a fundamental flaw with this position, that you cannot achieve your purpose through what you have proposed. It's not that I'm asking you to have a different purpose or to have a different method of attaining it. I'm just saying that there is an internal incoherence in that. You cannot achieve maximal pleasure at the end by maximizing pleasure at each episode. You need to have a completely different calculation. So this variant of hedonism falls short on its own terms. You cannot have maximal pleasure at the end by maximizing different episodes. That is not to say hedonism is wrong. That is not to say that there is some sort of an incoherence that is coming to light as juxtaposing hedonism with another doctrine, being a true Christian. It's about really taking what this variant of hedonism is and look at it and see if there is some sort of internal conflict there. Of course, in this example, we need a goal, right? There must be a goal. If someone shows up and says that I'm this variant of hedonist that just pursues maximum pleasure at every episode, and that's what I do, then what is what you do. It's just like there is no possibility of inconsistency if you don't have a claim that this leads to this other thing, right? Which is going to be important in our analysis of the immanent collapse of pure immediacy, or the alleged collapse of pure immediacy. But that's how I understand immediacy in a sense of a doctrine that is not as abstract of the discussion that is happening in the science of logic, but it's something about like internal inconsistency in that way. And of course, there are presuppositions there, but the presuppositions are again of a very different nature than presuppositions of, Jesus's teaching is correct, right? Maybe it's about a presupposition about something that we have talked about briefly, maybe some basic, logical points that if maximizing pleasure at each episode is not giving you maximal pleasure at the end, then we cannot maximize pleasure by pursuing maximal pleasure at every given episode. Something as basic as that, which I'm open to hear a criticism of, like, what is the presupposition? What is the logical presupposition there? But to me, it's clear this is not the same as juxtaposing hedonism of that kind with teachings of Jesus Christ. That would be a far more problematic and external type of presupposition than the one that I described.
Yes, I just it's a very helpful analogy, and we're surrounded with people like those. People completely confused. No, intellectual. I'm talking about myself actually. No, the thing is, one thing you talked about at the very end, I think is really important, is Hegel does not like receiving stuff externally.
Yeah.
Therefore, a very important way for us to understand the collapsing immanently is also to realize the standard used to help the hedonist or being in this context to realize its claim and its demonstrable nature or substance that are not the same. That incompatibility, the measure for this to come to such a realization must also be internally provided. Of course, I understand what you just mentioned, that granted that there seems still an opening that we are using the basic logic, then to say non-self-contradiction there. And we should definitely keep an open-minded. Listeners, if you have a suggestion on this, put it there. But we just want to show you that's how we understand this concept at this moment, and hopefully this understanding will be clarified and modified as we read along Hegel's text. But that's so far what we got about being movement or transition into nothing. Will you take us there? Why it must move? Why being cannot be pure immediacy as it claims to be?
Yes. And just as a reiteration of one last thing that you said, that we said in the last episode, I just remembered an example. This whole thing about, remember, this is a continuous attempt. And it reminds me of what Fichte did with his Wissenschaft. He has I don't know, 16 editions. I don't remember how many editions, how many revisions he has, and the revision, depending on the edition, you will get a very different story. So what we say here is our first attempt of trying to make sense of this, and in 10 episodes we may revisit this and realize that this doesn't work because of so and so, and we might do that very much because you guys tell us what is the problem. We don't, as we have said, we are not Hegelians in a way that we're just gonna stick to this no matter what. If there's a problem, we want to hear it. We crave it, actually. So make sure you, as we unfold what we think here, you are on offense. We love that. We want to be attacked in the right types of ways. So, okay, if this is the idea of immanence and immanently collapsing, let's go back to being as pure immediacy, right? And let's forget for a second, not necessarily forget, but put in the parentheses what Hegel does, and think about that. Okay, being as pure immediacy, let's think about the possibility of being as pure immediacy immanently collapsing. I can think about a couple of options, but not many, right? One of the ways to say that pure immediacy immanently collapses is that pure immediacy and proves to be not pure, right? For whatever reason, it is, we show that, oh, this wasn't pure, right? Or just very, utterance of pure immediacy involves some sort of impurity. But an impurity cannot be something that, just we are using language. That's the impurity. That doesn't sound to me as a very robust criticism. It could mean something else, something more general, maybe, which could be about maybe the impurity that could be in this case is that there is mediation. Okay, so the way that pure immediacy can be proven to not be pure is that it's actually not immediate. Its purity is nothing more about it what's other than its immediacy. Its purity is its immediacy. So purity is not a general point about purity, but it's pure as immediate. So the problem might be about mediation, which means this immanent collapse might happen because being proves to be not immediate, not mediate. So this might mean that the very utterance of pure immediacy involves mediation, but this cannot be the case for a couple of reasons. But one of the reasons is just actually textual. That because being collapses into sheer indeterminacy, which Hegel gives the name of nothing, and not mediation. Hegel doesn't say that, oh, okay, pure immediacy is not, it's collapsing, because check this out. It is mediated through like language, or mediated through this other thing. No, none of that happens. Which I'm happy that doesn't happen, because it seems to be a cheap way of rejecting immediacy. The sheer indeterminacy of nothing is not about lack of immediacy. It's about a different point, right? So if the transition that Hegel is looking for here is transition into sheer indeterminacy, then the problem that we're having is actually not about immediacy, but about indeterminacy or determinacy. Which takes us to the last alternative that I can think of here, is that the reason being as pure immediacy imminently collapses is because being proves to be indeterminate. But this could only be a problem if being as pure immediacy claims to be determinate. Otherwise, why determinacy is any sort of a problem? Which makes me think that the being is not just pure immediacy. The beginning of the book as being, as pure immediacy, is not just pure immediacy, but being as the claim that pure immediacy is sufficiently or self-sufficiently determinate, which is something else, right? And it's not something else in any sort of, I don't know, it's not absolutely shocking, but it is important. Because if we're saying that, oh, pure immediacy, okay, pure immediacy, sure, pure immediacy. As such, I don't see any sort of a claim. I see a claim about immediacy, right? But just claiming immediacy is not a problem. It could be a problem, but first of all, the transition that happens in the science of logic does not land into mediation, which makes me think that Hegel is not thinking that that's the problem, or that is going to be a problem, but it's not a good problem in this stage. At this transition, that wasn't the reason that there was an imminent collapse. If the imminent collapse, or even imminent transition, which might be a better term than collapse, is to indeterminacy, there must have been an idea of determinacy at the beginning, that pure immediacy is determinate. That now we have a realization that, okay, pure immediacy is not determinate. Pure immediacy is actually indeterminate. What I mean is that it would have been different if we said pure immediacy is indeterminate. That would be starting with nothing. Because remember what we discussed last time at the end of our discussion, sort of, and other parts of it. The Hegel thinks that the book, Science of Logic, could have started with nothing as well, as much as it could have started with being, because he thinks these two transition into one another. So one qualification that I want to add is with the term collapse that Holgate uses and we have used. But I think collapse implies some absolute failure. Like when a building collapses, there's no sign of the building anymore, right? But maybe immanent transition is a better term. Immanent transition in the sense that we thought being is so-and-so, but it ends up being a different thing. That doesn't mean that everything about being is now in the garbage. It just means that, okay, there is this. Being is actually ending up being this. So I cannot think of, at this stage of thinking about this project, as any other way of even formulating a possible immanent collapse / transition from being to nothing. That doesn't mean we haven't even started to talk about what this means. We're just trying to identify what could the transition be. We're not arguing that it is correct. We're just identifying what it is. And I cannot see any other option than this. There any other option than this, it seems to me like a leap that, pure immediacy collapses because, of course, pure immediacy doesn't exist. Everything is mediated. That is definitely not immanent. That's teaching of Jesus versus hedonism. That's not hedonism realizing something, right? And I think the parallel between hedonism, that example that I said, there is something important here, which is like, if I show the hedonist that maximal pursuit of maximal pleasure at every episode does not give maximal pleasure at the end, does not mean that the hedonist abandons hedonism completely. It means that there's a modification, right? And I think we need to think about the transition between being and nothing in the same way. Then, okay, this ends up being the case. But of course, we have a question now. Why pure immediacy is indeterminate? Before moving there, Trent.
Yes, I just it's very well done. I think what your reasoning is very clear. I just want to connect what you just said with the second point that it does not end in mediation, because I think that's precisely, you cannot use the Gospels to convert the hedonism. Hegel's project does not allow external importation, and the mediation is only meaningful, I suppose, through concrete mediator or medium, and that thing is not internal to the project. That is not in the sheer immediacy itself. It's something superimposed upon it to make it unhappy. I think a different way, for me at least, that's how I understood why this must move on, is being, if you think of this as a person, it remains unhappy, dissatisfied. Let's just think, still, I think that analogy with hidden is really apt here. It's like the hiddenness, like to really try to maximize the pleasure at a given moment. Then by the end of the month, you realize, oh my God, I'm really unhappy. What's going on here? And I think that's the case of being, because once you claim to be at the same time pure immediacy and also self-sufficiently determinate, that is like stable things, you will realize, no, the two do not work together. When I'm truly immediate and reject any mediation, I cannot really grasp myself. I don't know what I am, and I'm everything but determinate. Therefore, the realizing, let's place perhaps the accent onto the determinacy, then we realize, I cannot really hold on to the immediate part, stuff like that. So that's basically a reiteration of what you just said, which I think that parallel is really, really apt, and there's something interesting, very interesting going on what Hegel has in mind as a collapse, that is a switch or a transition, as you said, imminent transition from being into not mediation, but nothing.
Yeah, and I think the image of this kind of unhappiness or dissatisfaction, and although of course more personified than the science of logic aspires to be, but I think it's very much paralleled with this kind of a immanent development in general in Hegel, that when Hegel talks about phenomenology, he talks about the path of despair, if I remember correctly, that is just a continuous realization of that, I wasn't what I thought I was, right? I was this like I thought I'm so and so, and then I realize I'm not that, and the dissatisfaction of that kind, right, is something that is happening here. Of course, not in a personified way, but there is a form of dissatisfaction, and I cannot formulate this dissatisfaction unless I add the point about the determinacy, right? Unless I have a claim that pure immediacy is a determinate. If I only have pure immediacy, I don't know how to make sense of any sort of collapsing, because I don't hear any identity. I don't hear the full claim. I am purely immediate and I am determinate.
There's no I either, but carry on.
Yes, of course. There's no I, which we're going to talk about. But anyway, let's move on and try to see like what being indeterminate or determinate even means. Because, you know, we have a problem here. Because who is determining the meaning of determinacy at this stage? It's just like, what does that even mean, right? Like, what tells us that, oh, okay, this happened. That means pure immediacy is not determinate. Like, something must happen that says, oh, okay, this is not determinate. What is that, right? That is a process. And it must be a process. Otherwise, this just becomes a vacuous claim that, oh, yeah, it is indeterminate. What is indeterminate? Whatever I want to be. Like, it's not gonna make sense. So there must be some understanding of determinacy, which on its own may be a problem for Hegel. Because is he presupposing a conception of determinacy? And if that is so, then he is comparing pure immediacy with that conception of determinacy. Isn't that external to pure immediacy itself? The only way this cannot be this cannot be external is that pure immediacy itself kind of supplies a conception of determination, what it means to be determinate, which is hard for me to really accept. But let's elaborate a little bit what we have thought about, like what could be determination. And then we go back to this point, whether Hegel is actually presupposing something significant here or not. So one way to think about determination is that something is distinguishable from an opposite, right? They just like, it is determinate because, just to put it like concretely, it has certain borders, right? It is determinate because it is not this other thing, right? But that cannot be the conception of determination at this stage of science of logic, because the whole thing is about not having any opposites. That's how was the point about pure immediacy, that we're not making distinctions. It's just is undistinguishable. If pure immediacy rises as the champion of undifferentiated unity, there is no otherness. There is no border of anything. So this cannot be the case. The other thing is being articulable in language. That's determination. But to me, and I'm just going to say what I think here, and then Trent, you can definitely share what your position is. To me, that sounds question-begging. And in a weird way, it's not a question-begging thing that I have a problem with, but I think that doesn't jeopardize some important aspects of Hegel's project, even if that's the case. Why do I think it's question-begging? Because if pure immediacy disregards language as the bonus of determination, why should it fail because it cannot be determined in language? Like, that seems to be, that demand is not the demand of pure immediacy. that's a demand of Hegel, or maybe our demand. We could say that, okay, no, it's not about just language, but it's about being articulable in general. Okay, that could be something that is about like determination, but then we are in a territory that Hegel seems to disregard immediately, which is just, what if I think of this determination of pure immediacy as an esoteric experience only accessible through like some sort of a mystical experience? And you mentioned Buddha in a couple of episodes ago that, how do I know even if this is preachable, right? A little bit like that, right? It's just like, it is only a presupposition to think determination is not esoteric. Why? Yeah, so I have some ideas of how Hegel might combat this, but before moving there, I want to hear your thoughts, Trent.
Yes. One thing I had in mind while reading the text for the first time is the concept of time is somehow implicit there, that we can speculate, we can entertain the thought of a purely immediate state of being, yet that must not last. Because for it to last, that's why I particularly like the second point you raised, that it's been articulable in language. Language, to a certain extent, is a symbolic system. And the symbol is to hold fast onto something so that you can come back to that thing at a different time. Of course, the time means completely different things in Hegel's project at this moment. We'll talk about that later. But I think the parallel here is very important, because the claim that it is self-sufficiently immediate cannot be, demonstrated or be shown to itself. That being without, we cannot use mediation, but it's that a symbolic form holds onto that thing it claims to be.
So you are, I think the way that I understand what you were saying, correct me if I'm wrong,
yes, please,
is that you are saying that the problem with like asking or demanding from pure immediacy to be articulable in language is demanding pure immediacy to be mediated through a symbolic system of language. And that demand is not something that pure immediacy can accept, because it is a rejection of mediation through anything, symbols included.
Yes, that's one part of what I want to say. But on the other hand, I'm sympathetic to this challenge, but I don't think it's a valid challenge, in the sense that I think that self-consciousness is important. I don't know where that term comes from. People can talk about it later. For being to be happy, and then that requires something akin to that is symbolic form, but it must be a symbolic form that is immanently derived. And at this stage, if the pure being only claims to be self-sufficiently immediate, it does not provide itself with a language to talk to itself.
I see.
That's what I want to say. But what you said is right, is that we cannot use language in the natural sense of natural language, and there's an external critique of it. But I think the project, being in this project, craves for that language to be conscious of itself.
I think that's an excellent point. And I think it's get connected to one of the points that I wanted to say as a possible response from Hegel to all of these things. And that's the point, that it is on being as pure immediacy to prove itself as determinate, to supply that language, whatever that is like, okay, this means determinate. The problem is not that, from this Hegelian response, the problem is not that pure immediacy cannot articulate itself in language as we understand it. natural language, so on and so forth. It's that it is incapable of determining itself in any other way. Insofar as it is pure immediacy, it has already accepted that it's not articulable. Because any sort of expression of determinacy as a proof of determinacy requires something other than pure immediacy. Pure immediacy becomes this circular claim, or not necessarily repetition of a claim. Pure immediacy, I'm pure immediacy, I'm pure immediacy, I'm pure immediacy. To answer the question of what are you, it doesn't have any language of articulation. Now, Hegel is not necessarily thinking that pure immediacy needs to employ our language or this language or that language, but it must, to be more than a claim to determinacy. I think that's another way to put it. What is the difference between claim to determinacy and actually being determinate? And I think pure immediacy cannot make a distinction between the two. And there is nothing more than that happening. That from the perspective of pure immediacy, the claim to determinacy is not distinguishable from proving to be determinate, or it is not possible to move from that claim to the proof. It's just, it remains a claim. It cannot be anything more than a claim. Now, I think in that sense, which in another way, it gets connected to the second point that I have here, which is just not being self-sufficiently determinate. It needs something else to make sense of itself. Whatever that something else is, bring it on. We're ready to hear it. But if it's nothing, not in the Hegelian sense, but it's just, if you're not bringing any sort of expression of determinacy, all you have is a claim to determinacy. The claim to determinacy is not a proof for determinacy. And in that sense, this might be very much of a jumping ahead, but just like I got fired up for a second. In the sense that I think it might be the case that it's part of Hegel's ultimate project here is
you're really jumping
to prove determinacy, give a language to determinacy. That what it takes to show the concept is sufficiently, self-sufficiently determinate. But forget about that for now. Forget about that for now, because that's not a discussion that we need to have at this moment. I just wanted to point that out, that I think there is something about this. This problem is a problem that is going to stay with us. I think all of these concepts that we are going to pass by, all of these houses, are going to be insufficient in determining what they are. That's their unsatisfaction. That's their, in your language, unhappiness.
Yes. That the realization that the proof and claim do not match. But at this stage, it cannot even see the distinction between the two. But that unhappiness is felt for the desire of that's my current thinking, prompted by your fire, is perhaps. Yes, it's just a thought, just a speculation, that it cannot really honor the grounding objective to a certain extent, that thinking and being are not separated.
Yeah, I think that's another way of saying the same thing, right? Which is that pure immediacy does not have any path to determinacy. Right. And if it cannot determine, it could claim, amongst which is the claim, or the basis of that claim is the absolute self-sameness of whatever being in thought, but it's always just a claim. There's nothing more than a claim here.
Right. Yes, that's what I was saying.
Yeah, and I think this kind of leads to that is more now, through this discussion, I think I'm more satisfied with what we have made of Hegel's claim than what we read in Holge's case. That now this also means that there is only one thing that is determined here, and that is that pure immediacy is indeterminate, right?
Right.
If we are talking about claim and proof, right, the only thing that has been proven is indeterminacy, which just means that pure immediacy does not have any means to determine itself. The only thing that it is just indeterminacy. It is because it cannot go above a claim to anything more determinate. It's just indeterminate, which might not be a problem, right? It's not necessarily a problem. It's just something that came as a result of a tension that existed in pure immediacy.
Right.
Pure immediacy cannot be determinate unless that determinacy is determinate as indeterminate. Yes. The only thing that is proven is that it is indeterminate. Nothing else is determined. And if we want to be more happy about this, we could just say that it is determinate. It is just determinate as indeterminacy.
Sure.
It is just indeterminate. There's nothing more to be said. Because why? Because it cannot afford at this point to supply a language of determinacy, because that would be a betrayal to pure immediacy.
Right.
Any sort of supplying of language of determinacy beyond accepting indeterminacy is beyond the reach of pure immediacy, which could be fine, but it means that we have moved. Yes. And it seems like that we have moved imminently, or we want to think that way, or it is I think this is we have found something. I think we have found something that is definitely, dear listeners, as I said, attack this. We want to know what you think it's going on here. But this is better than just, saying that, oh, pure immediacy is not determinate because, or pure immediacy collapses because we need mediation, which could be like absolutely externalist the way of dealing with this.
Right.
Now, with all of this, we can go back to this transition and now revisit this point about being in nothing, and from being to nothing and nothing to being, how that happens, right? And this is the way that I formulated this. And in our discussions, we also came up with a nicer formulation at the end that will mention that. But this is the point. Being's only determination is that it is not determinate. Indeterminacy is all there is to being as pure immediacy. The name for such sheer indeterminacy is nothing. So we have moved from being to nothing in a Hegelian sense, right? Now, the first variation of my thought, which I think, let's keep it there as just something that I think now with this discussion might have changed, was that, but we haven't still refuted pure immediacy. We have only said that pure immediacy is indeterminate. This indeterminacy itself is purely immediate. The name for pure immediacy is being. So we have moved back from nothing to being. And this circular movement goes on. The name of this movement is becoming, which is what we're going to discuss in a further future episodes. I think this conversation and a pre-recorded chat about this episode has made a more palpable or more interesting, I think, formulation possible in terms of this whole back and forth between being and nothing. And it's about a matter of emphasis, okay? the transition from being to nothing is realization that we are determinate as indeterminacy, grasped immediately. And the transition from nothing to being is that understanding that this indeterminacy is a determination, grasped immediately. So, first of all, immediacy hasn't gone anywhere, number one. Number two, from what we understand so far, the tension must be about determinacy and indeterminacy, not so much about pure immediacy and impure mediation, right? It must be about determination and indetermination. So when we're moving from being to nothing, we are moving from that saying pure immediacy is determinate and realizing that for that, pure immediacy must supply a language. But if it supplies a language, it is not purely immediate anymore. So the only thing that pure immediacy could say is that I'm indeterminate. The only thing they could say, which takes us to nothing. But then indeterminacy is a determination. Like, why indeterminacy is a determination? That was one of my most important challenges here. Why isn't that just like a play with words, right? Because I think indeterminacy is different from determinate as other things, right? If I say something is indeterminate as opposed to something is determinate, I'm already determining it as a something. I'm giving it a character, not this other character. You see, like I could say, I'm just making this up. I'm improvising. So we'll see how it goes. But I could say just like something is determinate as A, right? Whatever that A is. What I'm saying is that is not something else. When I say it is the indeterminate, I'm already making a claim about what that is, about what the essence of that pure immediacy is. The essence of pure immediacy is indeterminacy. But I'm already in the action of determining when I'm doing that. That itself is a determination. I think that's the back and forth from being in nothing. That you realize two different sides of it. You realize, oh, this is nothing but indeterminacy. But then you realize indeterminacy itself is a determination. But then you realize, but this determination is nothing but indeterminacy. But then you realize, oh, indetermination itself is a determination. That's the movement, from what I understand at this point.
Yes, I agree with you. One thing I just add is that both determinate and indeterminate claim to be purely immediate. So they are at the same time opposite and also the same. So that's why it's a very counterintuitive, yet at this time, I think it makes sense. The whole being to, that's why you can start with either nothing or being. It doesn't matter.
Exactly.
And it's a going process, namely becoming.
Yes. It is I think the reason that we can start with nothing is clear now, because you can start with saying that, oh, nothing is whatever. Immediacy, pure immediacy in the forms of like absolute indetermination. But absolute indetermination is itself a determination of what is, as it is a different determination from another type of determination. It is itself a claim,
right?
And so on and so forth. That claim means it is something, but then what it is, it's nothing but indeterminate and back and forth. I think that dynamic is not. It is more satisfying than what I have encountered so far in Holgate's analysis. That seems to not delve much into this type of tension, and he doesn't elaborate much on this point about determinacy.
It's just as brief as a Hegel himself.
He's not very elaborate there. Although we need to another interesting comment that we got in another episode that I thanked the commentee. Is that a term? The person who left that comment as well, which was like the different, books and projects that other contemporary thinkers have had, other than Hegel's opening of Hegel's language by Holgate. And I just want to remember their name. I'll figure that out. But what I mean is that there are other interpretations that we haven't delved into, but maybe even more importantly, Holgate has an updated version of his interpretation that was also mentioned in that comment.
Wow. Awesome.
That is the full section of being in Hegel's Science of Logic, not the first part of it, but more than that. So it might be the case that if we get into that layer of discussion of like adding the second layer of Holgate, he might have this point about determination. But insofar as what we have right now, I think we have filled in something that is rather a gap in Holgate's discussion. So I think we're ready to reach our last point here. And why don't you, Trent, take a hold of this and begin talking about this like remainder of our questions that we have touched upon.
Yes.
Here and there, but maybe like putting them together as something that in the light of all of these discussions, maybe they have new meanings, or maybe we even have solutions for them.
Yes, indeed. On the slide, we see 3 questions, and we touched on all 3 of them at a different point in our ongoing discussion. The first one is the thought that why determinacy and indeterminacy form a natural pair that they would not stand on their own, but you cannot fit another entity in. So it must be a dual relationship or a polarized structure, as we put it on that. And initially, at least for me, I thought it was a smuggling of natural language concept, because, negation, not, or adding a negative prefix in, you have that. But based on our conversation, your improvisation to a certain extent, that seems more tenable and natural, in the sense that if we allow the concept of some basic logic, which is always something gonna be with us, to what extent are we allowed to use quote unquote logic in minuscule, not a capital L, to help us to understand logic with a capital L? That's the first question. And the second question is to really unpack and make sense of the term or phrase imminently collapse or shift or transit, as you mentioned. So what is first of all, how did that happen? But more importantly, what is the subject matter here? So with different iteration of the same being, are we just improving our articulation or conceptualization of being, or being itself is changed through this self-interrogating process, that it realizes, oh, I need, say, a language to feel happy again. And in so doing, in acquiring such a language, I'm no longer what I claim to be at the very beginning. So that's the whole process. Do you have something to add here, or should I carry on?
Yes. am not necessarily. One thing that I just say is that this is an important conflict amongst like the readers of Hegel's logic in our time, just to give an idea in terms of like, is this an ontological project, or this is more like not transcendental in the terms of its method, but it's more like what it takes for us to think being, which is different from saying what being is.
Yeah.
Right? And both sides to me have their own awkwardness. The side of saying that this is about only our thought of being seems to me to be self-defeating from the beginning, because the beginning of Hegel's logic must be with the suspension of that. If you're not suspending that, I mean, maybe it gets proven in the process, but from the beginning of Hegel's logic, we should not assume that this is just about our thought of being, because if we have genuinely suspended the distinction, it doesn't matter how much it feels that this is just about our thought. It can't be that. If you have already assumed that, then I think one of the most important things about Hegel is just lost. But the problem with the more ontological aspect would be that it gets a little bit awkward, because it seems like that pure immediacy is something that on its own is going through this process. Like, what does that mean? I mean, one thing that I can think of in this kind of an ontological way is that being as pure immediacy ends up being all sorts of other things, right? And that ends up being other things is not just about our thought of that being, it's about being itself. But this process is about our thought of being. We need to know what being is. We need to engage in thinking about being. And science of logic is thinking about being. So the progress is not something that the world itself is going through, but it is about our way of discovering the logical structure of the world itself and ourselves as well. The final claim is about being as everything, right? This undifferentiated unity of existence. The claim is about what that really means. It's about the determination of that, but the process seems to include thinking. I think at this point, we cannot really have an answer to that question. And as our discussion goes on, I think it's one of those themes that are gonna catch up with us, and we're gonna catch up with it in our discussions.
Yes, that's very helpful to provide the implications, I would say, of this question and what was really at stake and needed to really answer that question with any satisfaction. So we should bear that question in mind and keep doing this project. And the final question we raised is rather, we put it in a very poetic form. It's just, does being have memory? I think a different way to put it is, can being provide a system, a language, so to speak, so that it can refer back to itself, to develop a certain self-referentiality, so that at the end, when it really realizes what it really is at a different stage, they can refer back to each episode and identify itself. And the question here is, at least I had, is at this stage, at the early stage, is so formless and structureless. There's nothing to be pinned down or pointed at. But yet it seems that certain part of that being, whatever, has a certain memory faculty that allows or has the potential to later on differentiate or clarify into or once it gains that language, perhaps, to be assigned a name and identified. But at this stage, it is there so that it could be recognized in retrospect, but at this point, it has not yet gained that self-knowledge or clear enough. So that's, but I think that's important so that we would know that things after they collapse imminently or shift to a different form, it does not acquire new identity. It does not forget what it had gone through, but rather it will be able to synthesize or connect different episodes it went through along this journey of like thinking about itself, thinking about it. Yes. You have something else?
So I think this point in general is fascinating because I mean, for once, I think in one way, it gets related to your fascination with the point about memory in general, which I am indirectly fascinated by it through you, which is in a different context, but it is very interesting. You are interested in more like cultural memory and how things kind of have a continuous existence without any sort of
self-realization or consciousness.
Yeah. And I think actually that idea could be very much, applicable here in the case of Hegel's logic. At least that's my guess. That, like, so I'm going to paraphrase your project.
Sure.
That's what I'm going to do. And you tell me if I'm getting it absolutely wrong or not.
No,
but I think one of the things that you were talking about, which is about in your comparative historical project, is about how some level of identity is carried through time without any sort of a central consciousness of a system that consciously carries it through time. Like something like identity of France at a certain period in time, when we go and look at it, it's in many ways very much, just like a shattered mirror. Like it just, all sorts of things are happening. There's no unified necessarily like one single bureaucratic system that unifies all of these people. Some of them may not have any sort of connection, direct contact with one another, but there are different mechanisms in which the cultural memory survives in a form of being part of one story through different rituals, through different means of interaction with like social, localized social, even like figures like saints, like the way that they are kind of carrying the same type of a story or same type of a relation that makes it even possible for France to become a state, because this type of a primordial state of being one was already there, although no one was holding it. No single entity. There was no single flag for all of this as this point of unity. So, and when you were talking about memory here, I was also thinking about something far more primitive than that, which is just like the way that the earth remembers, right? And when I say the earth remembers, I'm just thinking about the geological cavities. The earth has layers. The earth doesn't have consciousness, but the earth kind of contains a story of itself with these different layers that are kind of piled up. Now it needs a discoverer, needs someone to go and look at it and kind of reconstruct this structure. But something akin to memory is already there. It doesn't have that level of consciousness. These are just some ideas that came to my mind. That the basic point of them is that memory may not need, all of these examples need a subject going and doing something, right, in different ways. So definitely that's not Hegel's science of logic. But I think what I want to take from them is this sense of memory and carrying something over time without even knowing you're carrying anything over time, but you're actually carrying something over time. Right. I don't think that is not metaphorically so far away from how things play out in the science of logic.
All right, thanks very much. That helps me to connect. Help me to understand why I'm doing this. Thanks very much. Yes, that's it. I think it's a very discerning way to draw a parallel between, because essentially for the way now that you talk about my project, I think what is that's not explicit, not routinized, not systematized way of constructing identity, and the core of identity is the ability to recognize oneself, not necessarily through juxtaposition with others, and that conditions the formation of self-referentiality. And I think that's my intuition at this moment. That mechanism is somewhat at place at a different stage of movement. That there's an identity of being which is sustained by nothing but itself, though itself does not have the language to articulate it, at least at this stage. Perhaps at the end, it will be able to say, oh, that part of me was holding me together, that part of me was holding me together. But it changes at every time, and the means of memory, the tools of a memory, perhaps also shifted together with its transformation at each stage. Therefore, it cannot be, say, predetermined at the very beginning. Therefore, at this stage, it really does not have the means to really identify that tool, yet that tool is there. So that every episode of this transformation is connected with everyone. And you can start, perhaps, like it's just a wild speculation, this project at every stage, but you will necessarily go through the previous stage, because the pure immediacy will be there, even if you start at a very advanced level with all the vocabulary. We still have to go back to that stage and see, why wouldn't this be sufficient? So perhaps that's the problem of modern reading and text, because this project, as my understanding of it, is must be read circularly. You have to read through the whole project, come through each stage of immanent transition. Then at the end, when you are reading the first transition, being to nothing, they will realize, oh, this makes sense in the context of every other transition. But at this stage, we're just starting to have a taste of what this transition really means. And maybe there is a unified thing, maybe there isn't. We can only suspend our judgment about it. Yes,
I think that's very good, and I'm glad this, although speculative, but I think there are interesting things about this whole point about memory and how it actually plays out in something like your research, and in terms of cultural memory, and how it plays out in a far more abstracted way or logical way in something like Hegel's project here. But I think for now, we've talked enough.
Indeed. It has been a very long episode, but I enjoyed it tremendously. So thank you very much, Adon. And thank you, dear listeners, for putting up with us. I'll see you or talk to you next time.
Take care.
Bye-bye.